This is a session where we have a panel titled STEM Strikes Back, How Elevating STEM Voices Can Restore the Academy's Reputation and How to Get Them in the Room. So I'm going to start off by, first introduce myself. I'm Wayne Stargard. I'm the president of the MIT Free Speech Alliance. MIT Free Speech Alliance is an alumni-led organization, and I'm wearing my alumni regalia today, which is striving to restore freedom of expression, viewpoint diversity, and academic freedom to MIT. Now, let me introduce our panel. On your left is Ian Hutchinson. Ian's a professor emeritus of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. He received his BA in 1972 and his MA in 1976 from Cambridge University. And he was awarded his PhD from the Australian National University. Ian's a plasma physicist, and he joined the MIT faculty in 1983, where he led the Institute's Tokamak Fusion Research Facility during its construction in the first decade of operation. He served as the head of the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering from 2003 to 2009, and he also crossed over to some administrative functions and served as a member of the MIT Committee on Academic Performance for 6 years. Not content to rest on his laurels as emeritus professor, last year he became a founding co-president of MIT's Council on Academic Freedom. Now in the middle, we have Luana Maroja. So Luana is an evolutionary biologist and professor at Williams College. She received her undergraduate and master's degrees from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and she got her PhD from Cornell. Her research focuses on population genetics and speciation. I said that right? Yeah. Okay. Speciation on a variety of organisms, including mammals, crickets, butterflies, and plants. Having been raised during a dictatorship in Brazil and having seen censorship live and immediate, she's become an advocate for free speech and academic freedom at U.S. universities, not just at Williams. Then on your right is Frank Laukien. Frank earned his BS in physics from MIT in 1984 and his PhD in chemical physics from Harvard in 1988. Frank's an innovation-focused entrepreneur. He's the president and CEO of the life sciences tool company Bruker Corporation, as well as being the founder and chairman of the fusion energy company Gauss Fusion. Frank's also a visiting scholar at the Harvard Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology and the Origins of Life Initiative. He is a member of the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard. And as you probably noticed during the introductions in the previous session, Frank's a member of the board of directors of the Heterodox Academy. And we're also honored that he's a member of the board of directors at the MIT Free Speech Alliance. So the backdrop to this afternoon's panel discussion is the decline in public's regard for universities. And because I'm from MIT, I got to have numbers. So Gallup is a famed market research organization, but they only began surveying on public confidence in higher education in 2015. First time they did that in 2015, they found that 57% of Americans reported a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. The most recently available survey results in 2023, that figure had dropped to 36%, a drop of over 20 percentage points in 8 years. Surveys by organizations like Pew Research Center suggest that the decline in the reputation of universities actually started earlier from a higher level. And unfortunately, we're seeing the results of the decline in the reputation of universities in today's headlines. We're going to try and address some of that today. So the format we're going to follow is that each of our panelists are going to make a brief opening set of comments about their view of the panel topic. Then I'm going to ask them some questions and have them explore this topic a little further by answering those questions. And then towards the end of the session, we'll open it up for you, the audience, to participate in the dialogue and ask them questions and explore it even further. So let's start with the opening comments. Start with you, Ian.
Thanks very much. To set the scene, I want quickly to comment on what STEM is and offer some opinions about what it has to offer. In STEM, science, refers to natural science, the study of the natural world, not social science, nor political science, etc. Technology refers to artificial systems to carry out purposes. Engineering is the design and analysis of such systems, including especially failure modes, risk, and the interaction with users. And mathematics is rigorously formulated logic. The strengths that STEM disciplines contribute to the academic endeavor include the availability of unambiguous questions and answers in science and mathematics, giving it universal applicability, the manifest demonstration of practical, reliable utility in technology and engineering, regardless of different cultures, the necessity of logical thought in STEM's practice, and the requirement to address problems dispassionately. The weaknesses of STEM for broader academic purposes include discomfort with ambiguity, de-emphasis, often obliviousness of human values, and tendency to arrogance. STEM thinking cannot restore confidence in the humanities and social disciplines. HxA disciplines possess knowledge, in my view, but that knowledge is not found by the methods of the natural sciences. Scientism, the belief that all real knowledge is found by science, is a ghastly mistake. And postmodernism was right about that. But it was wrong to suppose that STEM knowledge is as subject to uncertainty and fashion as it is in HxA. Society's disillusionment about the academy has various causes. Many are not academic, but one major cause is academic, and that is postmodernism's abandonment of truth-seeking, saying that all truth claims are just an exercise of power. That undermines the academic enterprise as traditionally conceived. Social activism is an unworthy replacement. It drives out dispassionate analysis and often deliberately overturns traditional family values and religious values. Another reason for the public's disaffection. STEM has much to offer in the current moment, including widespread public respect, despite the overreach of some of its promoters. Nevertheless, most universities find faculty in STEM much more reticent to engage in influential administrative policy making. And there are practical reasons for this. For example, STEM folks historically have much more funded research and resultant responsibility for groups and various types of busyness. In STEM, the relationship of the discipline to society is often very indirect. And STEM faculty are often impatient with undecidable controversy. So how can STEM help restore the academy's reputation? That's what we're here to discuss.
Okay, you want to riff on that, Frank?
Oh, I was going to let the lady go first, but I'm happy to go second. Okay. Well, yes, I'm a scientist by background, and so I agree with everything you're saying, and then broaden the scope a little bit. I often write STEM with, confusingly perhaps, with 2 M's, adding medicine. I think it's an awfully important field. If you observe recent debates, MIT is pretty much a STEM university, but Harvard is STEM and medicine and law school and divinity school and business school, and the list goes on and on and on. So in a broader university like Harvard University, where I had been a visiting scholar for the last 4 years, you see right now, as universities are under attack or are being criticized or being asked to reform, depending on your point of view, you see, to our delight probably, that STEM and at Harvard, particularly the medical school, the progress in medicine, we're going to cure cancer, we're going to understand Alzheimer's and so on, are shown as particularly worthy examples of the right to exist and of Harvard. And it's a little bit cute because you find the strong emphasis on STEM, which I'm delighted with, but by the same token, you sometimes obscure a little bit, well, is this same true? Is this true for every initiative and every center and perhaps every department and every school? So I think there is going to be, at the more broader universities, right now, perhaps they resist together, but I think there'll also be some distribution fights coming up. STEM universities, again, using the Harvard example, the medical school and the traditional STEM fields have been hit the hardest and will be hit the hardest by the withholding or reducing or withdrawal of grants that are often for medical research or for scientific research. On the other hand, they're not always perceived as being those that have veered most towards advocacy and some of these other things that universities are being criticized for. So I'll just leave it at that and broaden the scope of the discussion a little bit. And maybe my last sentence, if I may, and that's going to be the provocation for later discussion. And I think the STEM, there are many areas where within STEM, maybe not so much mathematics and engineering, but in the sciences that I'm quite familiar with, not only physics where I come from, but many other areas of science. There have been talks among scientists and sometimes among politicians or journal editors about the science says, or the settled science. And sometimes maybe in special relativity or the function, the DNA code, and many other examples, it seems the settled is science. The science is settled, I misspoke, and pretty much settled. But there are many, many other areas where it is far from settled and where there healthy debate is ongoing, and where you sometimes in the sciences, I detect in field after field, strong groupthink, lack of heterogeneity, lack of debate or punishment for those who wish to debate and have other views by, well, maybe you won't get promoted and get tenure, maybe you won't get a grant, maybe you won't get to publish in our journal. So the STEM field, the science in particular, but also areas of medicine, I think we also have a need for reform.
Okay, Luana.
You know, one of the things we notice in the administration, so at my college, at least I'm a small liberal arts college, and we have a lot of committees, and the committees do have participation from the three divisions, which is humanities, social science, and sciences. But when you look at the people who are taking decisions, very rarely we actually have participation of scientists, and for reasons that they are too busy with their own research and so on, and typically do not feel like it is their place to interfere with some decisions about campus life or student living and all these things. And over time, a lot of committees have been in my college dismantled, and decisions are being taken at higher and higher levels with fewer and fewer professors participating on decision. I think that one of the big changes has been like the entire removal of professors from campus life decisions, which have been transferred almost entirely to the DEI and campus life administrations. And this was done with celebration from most of the professors. You know, they're like, finally, I don't want to decide where the students are going to live or what they're going to do. That's up for them, not for me. So we actually cheered on the dismantling of our own participation in the administration at the college. And in the last 2 weeks ago, my college was famously, it came out in Science, the first college to deny NSF grants. So now we didn't sign on to the new regulations, to the new requirements, and we can no longer get NSF grants. And this actually caused a wave of action from the science like I never saw before. Like, people got together, they did petitions. Within 3 days, we had 75% of the professors signing to a petition to demand back these grants, that it's our livelihood, and we can't simply, and it's not just about money. And that finally got us like a talk with the president and the lawyers and everybody else that actually did the decision. And they came to this decision without consulting anyone at all in science. Zero people were consulted in sciences, and you know, I've never seen people so united before. So that was was good to see. But I think that's one of the things that you get when you remove the scientists entirely from decision making at the college. So I don't have much else to say. And,
for the moment.
Right.
Okay, so let's go to some directed questions. Now, Ian already touched on this topic. But I'm looking for more thoughts. Why do you think the reputation of universities has degraded over the past decade, and particularly have the STEM disciplines contributed to this loss of public confidence? Who wants to go first?
Well, I think the reputation has degraded as many universities. Well, we heard about the monasteries and the printing press, so there is also technological change going on. And we're not immune to that. You can do lifelong learning these days without going to a university or to an extension school, and most of us hopefully are doing lifelong learning. And I mean, I think it was the internet where we really learned a lot, and very, very easily, without spending months in the library. So there's technological change that makes parts of universities less important. There are alternatives. That's a fundamental technological trend. That's no political comment. But in addition, I mean, parts of universities, certain fields, certain initiatives have moved away a little bit from this Harvard telos of veritas. I think every university has it. Knowledge seeking, that we would probably all agree on mostly. And some of them have moved more, to a greater degree, towards advocacy, and thought that that's a legitimate thing that universities or departments should do. We've seen the reduced importance of faculty relative to staff and administration. I think it's this talk about administrative bloat, I think, is not an invention of the present administration. That's it's obviously taking a very aggressive approach to some universities more than others. But there is certainly a great increase in looking at the economies of universities. Tuitions have gone up dramatically. Cost of universities have gone up. The overhead rates charged by universities have gone up. And that party has continued for a long, long time. It is now being questioned, and I bet we're not going back to where we were 3 or 4 months ago, whatever the new operating model for the sciences and medicine will be. And the list continues probably. So there is a fundamental technological change, and there have been trends where university leadership, corporations, trusts have been, I think slow to react, and in some cases perhaps failure to respond to these trends and do the right thing until they're now very publicly being criticized, and in some cases I think rightfully so.
But the STEM disciplines have been blameless in this loss of reputation, right? Or not?
Well, I can give some examples in which we are not blameless. So biology has possibly been one of the most affected disciplines within STEM that became somewhat ideologically captured in many ways. So I think that the sex binary might be one of the most obvious aspects in which you see that many biologists, this is not just gender studies people, many biologists started to embrace this idea that there is somehow a continuum, because you see a continuum in the phenotypes. Therefore, sexes must be a continuum because there is also tall woman, and forgetting that that the definition of sex has always been a gamete definition, which applies to all animals from sea urchins to humans and also vascular plants. So small versus large gametes, and there is actually only 2 types. But like I printed out my evolution conference is happening right now. I had to choose to come to this one instead of the evolution conference that I usually go. And they have a whole symposium on teaching sex and gender in science education, in which they say that we can't harm trans students. This is too small for me to read. I should have printed a little bit. But the gist is that you're going to cause harm if you say sexes are binary, and therefore you can't say sexes are binary because you're going to cause harm, and you have to look at all the ways in which sexes are not binaries. And of course, in this case, you're focusing on humans because nobody is arguing that there is a degree of hairiness in sea urchins or God knows what they are talking about. But you can see that there is an ideological capture there in which they're letting go of science in which to adhere to this ideology. And I think this too removes trust in the universities. These and many other crazy things that are happening in our campuses. So you have classes that, like just to give an example, like in my college, there are classes in environmental sciences in which not me, which some professors teach students that climate change is an invention of white colonialists to justify colonization in Africa. And this is actually deviating entirely from science, and as the parents hear that, they too lose trust, not to mention the dropping merit and the immense grade inflation that we are observing. In my college, what happened after 2020 is just unbelievable. Not only they dropped the SAT, and I don't know how they decide who's going to get in, but also the amount of grade inflation took a change. It was happening, and it was happening for 20, maybe more, has been happening forever. But it just did an inflection. You look at the graphs, and it's just like, so we dropped Dean's List, we dropped the valedictorians, we dropped because there are too many of them, so it makes no sense. So all these things are happening, and they too take away the trust, I think.
The list continues, if I may. I mean, I won't try to repeat them. Maybe on the climate debate, I mean, how contentious that is. I mean, I'm not going to enter the debate, but whether someone uses the term climate change denier or climate alarmist, there you know it already. Both these terminologies indicate that there is a significant societal and debate and disagreement on these things. And global warming is happening. I think most science will agree with that. But whether it's reason for alarm or more research, or whether it started with the end of the little ice age and all, then it gets more complicated in the climate models. I think one very egregious example that has upset a lot of us is that scientists, including academic scientists and of course government scientists at some point during the pandemic, suggested that it was inappropriate and perhaps racist to ask about the origin of the COVID virus. And anybody suggesting that it might have come out of a lab was deemed as out of limits and perhaps making anti-Chinese, anti-racist remarks. Today, it is not clear where the virus came from, but it is also not settled science that it came from a market or from a Wuhan Institute of Virology. And that, of course, the people that were highly conflicted and helped organize that behind the scene, which became obvious afterwards and should have recused themselves at a minimum from these kind of discussions, that was quite egregious. And journals that went along with that, I think it was The Lancet, organizing or accepting an organization of partly conflicted virologists to say there is only one way to view this point, to have an appropriate view, I think was very, very damaging to scientists' trust in other fields of science where I don't have any insights, and of course the general public. So there have been some examples that have diminished.
So I would say, to summarize much of this, the politicization of science is part of the problem.
Yes.
So let me lead that question a little bit further. So a lot of research at universities today is government funded. The spigots are controlled by politicians who want to make policy decisions, and they feel they need to have a degree of certainty in order to make those policy decisions, and they go steer the money to places where that certainty will be represented, true or not. Is that an element?
Well, that's one side of it, is that the politicians want to manipulate some aspects of what the public understands as being settled science. But there's another side, and that is that scientists are increasingly being urged to become politically active and politically sensitive and become advocates in ways that historically they didn't see the need to. Now, maybe it is a good thing, and I think it is a good thing, that scientists should be good at conveying the value and the significance of their science to the general public. And that's one aspect that of this. But at the other side, this becomes a kind of self-serving approach if we're not very careful about it. And the scientific societies are by no means free from guilt in respect to this. Of course, a society like the American Physical Society, which represents all of physics in the US and to an extent around the globe, has historically had a role for advocacy for physics. But this has become so strongly politicized, and it's also become captured by whatever is the latest thinking in social activism, so that there are aspects of science which those of us who are active in the sciences don't recognize as being part of, in a certain sense, part of science, but that are controlling what happens.
A little bit of a different aspect of all of that. So there is the advocacy and the capturing by political tendencies and cultural tendencies. I think also science, even pure science, thrives on heterodox thinking and on questions. I just read this again the other day. So one of the greatest scientists of all times was Albert Einstein. He was convinced there shouldn't be spooky action at a distance, that there shouldn't be gravitational waves, and there shouldn't be black holes. He was wrong on all three of them, and I think in recent years Nobel Prizes were given for proving that wrong, yet he was one of the greatest scientists and most imaginative minds of all times. This is a non-political, non-advocacy, really good example of scientific debate and heterodox views. We're the Heterodox Academy, and there are current examples of that. Modern synthesis, evolutionary biology, and those that criticize the modern synthesis and think it doesn't have enough explanatory power and perhaps in part is wrong or just limited in its scope. That's one of my hobbies. That's what I wrote a book on, so I'm very tokamaks versus stellarators. That's a pretty benign debate, but one can even dispute of how best to do fusion.
I think that's one of our strengths in STEM, is that we actually do.
We should cherish that.
Yeah. And if that becomes suppressed, it will be a great loss for the academy, for this society.
Well, let me follow up on that. I mean, you've referred to some of the approaches by the non-natural science disciplines that are not necessarily following a scientific method, maybe appropriately so. The increasing tendency of STEM faculty to join the activist causes and ranks. How can STEM faculty though, insulate themselves from these influences to remain true to the scientific method and the scientific approach that the public can then respect?
Refocusing on knowledge seeking and truth and experimental validation, and maybe being just like universities. Many universities have now, and at the recommendation of the Heterodox Academy, and some have done it without needing a recommendation, committed themselves to university viewpoint neutrality unless it really affects the core missions of research or teaching. I think some restraint and some humility are useful there.
You want to jump in this one?
No, well, then the next one's for her.
Okay, go ahead.
So universities are unique, and they operate under a shared governance model in which both the administration and the faculty participate in setting the direction of the university. In theory, what role do you think today in modern universities the faculty actually has in this relationship? So you go first, Luana.
Okay, so I'm speaking to my small liberal arts college, not to larger universities, and I don't know how that translates to big universities. As I mentioned in my opening, I think our power has been reducing significantly over time since I came. There are fewer committees. We have much less of a decision making. If there is any committees, they are like, to give like some opinion or advice, but they are not decision making. And we've been losing power. I think we do still retain power in hiring decision, but to some extent. So even our hiring decisions today are very much controlled by the DEI department, for example. So our hiring lists are vetted. We have several passes of like if the list of candidates is not as diverse as the list of PhD students in the field, then we can't go ahead. Then the next, the 25 top applicants that will be phone interviewed, if they're not as diverse as the list was, then we can't go ahead. Then if we go one step lower to the campus interview again. So in all these phases, we are vetted by the DEI office, and we cannot go ahead unless we get the approval from the DEI office. We still have the hiring decision to the final candidate, but there is all these checks that were not present when I was first hired in 2010. So these things have been added and added and added. And it became more bureaucratic, right? So every step you have to now keep lists of all the decisions that went on to each candidate. You have to fill these sheets, and to some extent this can be good because to the extent that you may not be paying attention to all candidates, etc. That there are biases and so on. I may improves like how deeply you're looking at each person, but it's. I think it adds a certain level of fear in which people are, is this diverse enough? Oh, we need to add a woman. Oh, we need to add, at every step of the process. So we lost, I think, some. I would say that the hiring decision is still in our hands, but we lost some freedom in that path. What else? I mentioned that in my college we have entirely lost any committee that had to do with student life. So we used to be part of all these committees, and no longer now faculty are no longer part of these committees. And I think that was a big loss.
Was that self-inflicted, or was that imposed by the administration?
It was imposed by the administration, but celebrated by the faculty. At least by many faculty I know, including myself, was like, okay, like one fewer committee. But I think it came with a big cost that was the ever higher infiltration of DEI in campus life. So now they train all the JAs or the RAs, like in other colleges they're called RAs, the resident assistants. Yeah. The resident assistants are now trained by DEI and campus life people, and they have become very much monitors of behavior among the students.
Yeah, if I could jump in at this point to affirm this. I mean, I taught at MIT for just over 40 years. During that time, the number of administrators employed at MIT grew by a factor of 5. The number of faculty was entirely stagnant. It was 1,000 when I joined, and it's still 1,000.
And the number of students, too.
And so, you know, that to me is the biggest commentary on your question, which is, to what extent do faculty control what goes on at MIT? And the answer is that influence has been diluted by a very large fraction, primarily because of the enormous growth in the administrative staff. Now, it's that growth in administration has not entirely been a free decision of the institute. Much of that, or substantial part of that, has actually been imposed by the federal government and by various regulations associated with Title IX and Title VI and so on and so forth. So actually Congress has and the presidency has something to blame for that. But the truth of the matter is, we faculty have not resisted that to the extent that we should have, I believe, but the truth is we have lost a large amount of the influence on what student experience is all about at MIT, and I believe that's true at most universities and colleges throughout the US.
You agree, Frank, or you have a different view?
No, I agree with everything that's been said. I think there's some reason for hope. Maybe the pendulum is beginning to swing back a little bit at certain universities. But I think the numbers that you cited from MIT would be true at Yale and Stanford and just about everywhere else, at least directionally, right? So the faculty clearly has lost power in the last, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 decades relative to administrators. There are many more administrators. Should a faculty alone run the university? Is the university there for the faculty? No, that's not the case either. There's students, there are alums, there's administrators, there's a board of trustees or corporation or whatever it may be called. But I think the pendulum has swung too far towards too much administrative bloat and not enough say by the faculty that very often also just choose to do their research or writing their books or teaching their courses. So, but I think that hopefully that there's a bit of a reversal of trend where we have a better balance again.
So, faculty influence has eroded. Think of STEM faculty in particular. Do they even in this eroded environment, tend to be underrepresented in faculty and university governance? And if so, why?
Well, the answer is yes, they do. Even at a place like MIT, which is, after all, an institute of technology, the faculty in humanities and social sciences are far more strongly represented compared to their numbers on the faculty at MIT than would be proportional. So that's certainly the case. Again, I don't entirely blame, the folks in HxA, because the truth is, if you're a scientist or an engineer at MIT, you want to get on with doing your science and your engineering. And so there's a tendency to be distracted and be regarding your job as being, to do those types of things. By contrast, if you're a literature professor or a philosopher or something like that, or in sociology, there's a more direct connection in many respects of your professional research and scholarship, or it seems that is the case, to the administrative roles in the university. But we in the STEM business have to become more proactive.
I think there's also the fear factor. Until not very long ago, where I'm on a visiting committee of one of the departments of science at MIT, and I'm in the Cambridge environment on both ends of Mass Ave. It was, people were fearful. Most people were not as courageous as you in speaking about DEI and maybe a DEI administration having too much say, and whether they even agreed with some of the goals, which are, I mean, inclusivity, we probably all agree, but if the flip side of that is reverse discrimination, then we're not so sure perhaps. So, but it was literally something that people would whisper and look over their shoulder, literally, when discussing some of these things in faculty promotions, in searches, etc. That seems to have, and this has nothing to do with the recent change of Trump administration.
Right.
Even a couple of years ago, I observed at Harvard with the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, and then the MIT CAF, similar organization, after the Dorian Abbott cancellation of an EAPS lecture at MIT, you all put together the
Statement on freedom of expression.
Yeah, you put together a faculty, sorry, I misspoke, a freedom of speech association by alums that wouldn't take that anymore. I think the climate, maybe not at Williams, I don't know yet, but in some of the places that I observe, the climate has changed pretty significantly to where the fear factor is almost gone. There's still extrajudicial or troubling judicial procedures and Office of Faculty investigations and so on that had led to some very deplorable injustices at the universities that I know. We won't have to go into the examples. There's still something pending. There's still a lot of work to be done. But there is hope, and there is an improvement trend. Almost slowed down a little bit, ironically, by the strong arming by the Trump administration. That, because people tend to resist, they tend to be perhaps less inclined to continue the necessary reforms. I think that's an interesting dilemma that I'm sure John will be talking about more at your conference here. Yeah.
Luana, you're one of 3 divisions at Williams. Are you equally represented in when the faculty does have influence?
Almost every committee in Williams will have representatives of every division. The number of hours, there are way more majors students in the sciences than there are in any other division. However, there are way more professors in other divisions than there are in the sciences, because they have these tiny majors which requires like specialty positions. Here we are hiring a trans studies person now. So there are all these additional hires that go on, and they stay there because if you eliminate one, you lose a particular discipline. So there is more professors in divisions. Science is division 3 for us, so divisions 1 and 2 have more professors than other divisions because of the number of sub-disciplines, whereas biology is one big thing, or computer science is our most crowded major now. But the willingness of writing to the president, start petitions, all these things, this happens a lot more. And I do agree, by the way, that the climate is changing and that people are less afraid and that they are speaking more. And in my college, at least, one thing that I noticed with the Trump administration is that the DEI people who were very aggressive, and one of the people who did the cancellation of Dorian Abbott was a professor in my college in geology, started the signature campaign, or at least one of the people who started signature campaigns. So these people that were in the more, in this case she was actually in sciences, but there were lots of people in the non-sciences that would start cancellation campaigns or organize or lights to the president, pushing for this, pushing for that. They were way more organized, and there is always like petitions going on from their side and very rarely coming from the science, the exception now being the cancellation of NSF and NIH grants that mobilized the science professors like I've never seen before.
So if STEM's underrepresented, is this a bad thing or a good thing? Can STEM faculty make a positive contribution to university governance? and specifically in what ways?
Well, admitting my bias, I would think yes.
Yeah, we're all biased here.
For some of the reasons that
but let's justify the bias.
But at least proportionate representation, which seems to be underrepresented, or sometimes you have overrepresentation even at MIT, as you cited. I think the statistics are correct. There are some centers at MIT that barely have any students and have a lot of professors, and they were typically created in the last 20 years. So is voting by popular demand of the students shouldn't be the only way of assessing something, but there should be some sort of a visiting committee or others. I think most visiting committees these days are rubber stamps, quite honestly. I don't think they're very critical in many cases from my very limited, narrow view and experience. But there should be some real, do all departments and initiatives, do they really warrant, do they have, is there enough merit in what they are doing? And there might be some where maybe some pruning is appropriate or some merging is appropriate, to where they maybe are not only not popular with students, but perhaps also don't quite have the same academic merit as other departments or subjects.
I think that one thing that science can really help with administrative decisions is in the emphasis we put in empirical data collection, right? So many times, so just few of the decisions that my college took that I thought were terrible decisions were literally based in a survey with 10 students. So you do a survey with 10 students, probably like, you don't even know if the email went to all students who responded, but literally some decisions are made based on surveys which are completely biased in themselves. How do you like it? I like it very much, or I love it is the only ranges, of their responses, kind of thing. And I don't think a scientist would let that kind of survey even pass. So I think that there could be things to be gained in like how do you decide things, and let's collect data, let's see what happens and I think that is lacking in a lot of decisions.
Well, maybe what's happened to scientific federal sponsorship of science at the moment will galvanize people in the sciences and engineering faculty to take a greater role. That maybe there's something good will come out of this.
Yeah, well, my next question is, okay, so what's going to get STEM faculty to get more involved? What's it going to take?
Well, that's my answer, maybe.
Take the
Self-interest.
NSF grants away. Cancel the NSF and NIH will definitely get us more engaged. Also, we won't have to do research.
Well, I think I think we're only at the beginning of a major financial redistribution battle within universities. Maybe not so much MIT because it's mostly STEM, but you take a big Yale, Harvard, Brown, whatever, NYU. If indeed you do not get your overhead rates that you can prove, and it's 68%, I think those days are probably over. So maybe you'll get a narrow overhead of 15%, and then you need indirect cost. You need a computational and an animal facility and a genomics facility and a bunch of other things to do science and medical research. But then, of course, a lot of the other overheads that were unaccounted for and opaque to those that were giving NIH or DOE and NSF grants, who are now saying this is not right, they were used for administrations and other centers and other projects at universities. And so far, it's still unified ranks against that. But as you will probably end up with much lower overheads and indirect cost, then the distribution battles within universities will begin. And that will, to some extent, pit STEM and medical researchers who will say, wait a second, I'm bringing in this funding. Why am I? And maybe now they will be taxed within the university, not a tax to the federal government, but by whatever, the provost or something like that, to fund a bunch of other things that so far, that was fine. It was free money. It came from the federal government. When it comes out of their grants, we're only at the beginning of a significant financial redistribution battle that
Yeah, I'm Terry Maroja. As an NIH-funded investigator for 30 years, the grants barely pay for my direct costs. I did not take a salary increase for about 15 years because it was either me or 10,000 mice or a raise for my postdocs. So I think that's an interesting idea that you could tax the directs and get money out of it. But I have to say, I think given the way grants are awarded, it is not likely to happen. What's happening among my colleagues is they're firing people. I can't afford to pay the extra postdoc. They're killing animals. This is at a hospital. I'm at Beth Israel. I was at Beth Israel Deaconess. I'm still there partially. And we're not getting the direct hit from the government, but we are getting hit from the government. People are just losing their jobs. The assistants are losing their jobs. There's some grants administrators losing a job. There may be other sources. Maybe the hospitals can figure out a way to make money, but the direct costs of the grants barely covered what I was doing for a good 30 years.
Oh, completely believe
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I have to.
No, you're completely right.
That's all good commentary, but we want to save it for a point when you get to have a microphone so that it gets recorded.
We heard you loud and clear.
So wait just a bit. But let's follow up on this comment. I mean, an outside observer, or maybe even an internal observer, would say that in a multidiscipline university, the STEM disciplines are earning their way because they bring in internal research grants, and that some of the other disciplines, some of which are maybe more the targets of government ire nowadays, don't earn their way. So when the university is facing reduced research overhead funding, notwithstanding your experience, and the university says, we're just going to cut all departments by 15%, will STEM faculty stand for that?
Well, I think the bottom line is that STEM faculty, such as me, have long worried about the large overhead rates, the indirect cost rates. And we've basically always had to bring in research grants that cover those, at least those that we've obtained from federal sources. There are, of course, other sources of funding for science and for other things too. By and large, those that come from foundations and so forth refuse to pay the indirect costs. Nice. And so the MIT administration in various ways or other wangles has to make those up. So this indirect cost argument is very complicated, and it's been very uneven, and there has in fact been a flow of funds from the federal government grants to all kinds of diverse, very often non-scientific support for universities. So I don't want to be a defender of indirect costs as a mechanism for supporting universities, and I think many STEM faculty rankled a little bit by the magnitude of the indirect costs that they often end up paying and others often don't. But bottom line is, it costs money to do scientific research. You have to have the infrastructure to do it. And there has to be a way of doing that. Otherwise, you experience what we just heard from the audience, which is basically you have to fire people, or you have to kill animals, or you have to dismantle your equipment.
Yeah, no, but I think when I used the term tax, I should have chosen a different word. So far, for every dollar you got for your direct cost, 69 cents went to Harvard. I don't know whether it was Beth Israel.
It was an additional 69 cents.
Yeah, but
I got $1. Beth Israel got 69 cents.
That's right. And Beth Israel is a little different. Beth Israel Deaconess is not Harvard Medical School. It's not Faculty of Arts and Sciences. So everybody has different overhead rates. But anyway, and some of that was needed for an animal facility or for a computational facility, research infrastructure and research buildings that you need. But some of it also went effectively from the medical and scientific STEM research over to other parts of the university where STEM researchers in the future will speak up more, will have to speak up more, because effectively they've been funding other things in the universities. And I think one will have to make at least consensus choices and not, okay, so far this was all free money that flowed through, as long as I got my direct grant for whatever disease research you may have been in or animal research. So I think it's gonna, in some ways, gonna get tougher and more interesting to where STEM, including medical researchers, will speak up, and there will be winners and losers within universities.
Sounds like you're going to give up on research at Williams, though. So.
Or maybe not.
No.
Okay, final question before we go to the audience. Notwithstanding Ian's opening comments about the limits and of the scientific approach and scientific method to address some of society's overall problems, what does a scientific approach to problem solving that the STEM faculty bring have to teach university leaders that are looking to navigate the culture wars that they're currently dealing with?
I hesitate to think that scientists and STEM researchers are somehow superior in their reasoning and will come to better judgment on difficult non-scientific issues than people from the humanities or social sciences or law school or business school, for that matter. I would hesitate to assign a higher degree of rationality just because we believe in science and scientism. I remember your comment earlier, maybe in a disproportionate belief in what science can bring. So I think scientists should also stay humble.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that there are many university presidents who have leadership qualities and excellent judgment and related skills in advocacy and so forth, who are outstanding people who are from outside the sciences. But I do think that the problem that I alluded to in my opening is one of the key things. If the universities give up the search for and the belief in truth, then they have no business in continuing to exist, quite frankly, in my view. And so I think that there are ways in which the humanities and social disciplines have been derailed from that search for truth by various philosophical viewpoints that have grown in the second half of the 20th century and in the first quarter of the 21st to dominate some of those disciplines. And I think that if that viewpoint becomes controlling of the administrations and the missions of universities, then I think we're in dire trouble.
I think a few things that we could, that I think that we are actually in a better position to look at empirical evidence. So, for example, you take the politicization of academia. There has been a big study looking at what happens when scientific institutions, scientific organizations take on political sides and signal political decisions, do political statements, etc. And what happens is that the public loses trust. So if you have that in hands, then perhaps that can guide your decision of doing or not doing political statements, and taking the Calvin report and becoming politically neutral in an institution. It's a sound decision made with empirical backing, and I don't think that everyone outside science see it this way. They see that it's a matter of being higher moral ground and that you have to do these statements because it's the only way to proceed, not realizing that by doing these statements, not only you don't change anyone's mind, but they stop trusting you, which is not what we need. I mean, we are already sinking So things like that, I think we can contribute more, but I agree with you too that we're not owners of the reality or whatnot, but
No, and I agree with everything you said, but I would maybe add to that. I mean, in math, maybe there's only one truth and one correct answer. In the sciences, sometimes there's a vigorous debate, right? When people first proposed continental drift or ice ages, these people were it took decades before people accepted that that's probably the scientific truth, or almost certainly the scientific truth. In other non-natural sciences, there isn't going to be necessarily one truth, but at least we should strive for knowledge. We should insist on not only civil discourse and constructive disagreement, but a rational approach, and accept, which is why we're here, a plug to John, right? The Heterodox Academy, at least you should have heterodox views that subscribe to we're knowledge seeking, we're going to do this respectfully, we're going to do this with argument in an irrational approach. In many of the social sciences, in law, in business, there isn't one truth, but that doesn't mean we have to degrade into advocacy.
And I would suggest that process is a hallmark of the STEM community. And that process is part of what we can convey.
Yes.
Okay, let's go to get you involved in the discussion. My colleague has a microphone. Raise your hand. I'll call on you. He'll hand you the microphone. Please give us your name and your affiliation. And please ask just one question. If you have to give context to the question, please make it short. Don't give a speech. Okay, sir.
Hi, thank you for that discussion. That was wonderful. My name's Josh Baker, University of Nevada, Reno, and I would like to go back to Wayne's initial question, because I guess my feeling is always we can't fix other people, we can fix ourselves. And going back to this question is, are we doing everything we can? And I love Frank's kind of comment about the science is settled, and the sort of this kind of sense that I get a lot in science, that it's already settled, that there's sort of a sense of appeal to consensus, and it seems to me that a lot, especially in biological sciences, we ignore kind of the laws of uncertainty, quantum mechanics and thermodynamics, and there are a lot of sort of absolutists in that field who know the answer, who know how biological systems work, and I see this in many disciplines, and I think this is part of the problem. I mean, I think that we have to look at ourselves and we have to look at science and say, how can we fix our belief that we know the truth when a lot of times there's a great deal of uncertainty. And I'm wondering, in terms of like review processes, grant processes, funding process, how we fix that in ourselves.
In the biological sciences, if I may, and I know you're a biologist as well, I mean, I think there's Exhibit A. Is 25 years ago, we had the Draft Human Genome Project. It was touted. People were optimistic, legitimately. Bill Clinton was in the announcement 25 years ago. It was the book of life. We were going to do more sequencing, and then we understand 90% of biology. Today, many of those folks who were on the initial Human Genome Project have said, wow, we're at the end of chapter 1. We now understand 25%. The skeptics say 10% of biology, and it's infinitely more complex, and there's systems biology and multiomics and spatial, and I won't bore you with all of that. But that's a classical example where there was a false optimism and feeling of certainty, and if we study everything by genetics, we'll have all the answers. We learned a lot. So much came out of genetics. It's foundational, but I think today people are much more humble and realize how much they do not understand, and how many other fields in this, I refer to it as a post-genomic era, how much we don't know and what other tools we need, what other questions we need to ask. I'm sure you have other examples from evolutionary biology or whatever it might be, but there are other examples for sure.
Any other thoughts about how we cure ourselves?
The things that are being decided at the university that take trust away from the university I'm not sure that they fall into this grandiose thing like understanding, for example, like disinviting speakers because they may offend someone is clearly a thing that I think it's an easy decision, that we don't need it's easy. It's like you survey people, what happens when you disinvite someone? Well, they get more press, they get more invitations to other events, they get more famous. Well, that doesn't fit into the more moral high ground where you want to prevent people from being offended, because now there is more people listening to the people. So, there are some simple things that can be decided that I actually think that we can get to those truths. So, for example, doing political statements, like the time that the president of my university would do political statements every time that something happened in the high school. I'm not kidding. Didn't help. It didn't solve the problem, and it made us look fool. Like it wasn't good. And actually, she did, to her credit, decided that those statements are not working, and she will no longer do political statements. She decided that after October 7, when time for that statement came. But nevertheless, she did decide on that, and that I think it's a good thing. So there are certain things that are easy decisions, and there are certain things that aren't, and I think that we can actually get to the easy decisions, I hope.
You want to add to that? Okay, let's move to the next question.
I'm leaving it alone. Let's hear some more questions.
The gentleman with the glasses right here down the middle has had his hand up for a while. Yes?
The one with the hair.
I didn't want to go there.
My name is Louis Mattel. I'm a statistician at NYU. We say in statistics, there's this quote, it's like, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I'm wondering if maybe we sort of have a failure in how we're talking about the interface between science and the public, or science and society. Maybe we're not explaining ourselves correctly, and then, something like COVID happens, and the situation is much more complicated, and people aren't stupid, and they see that. So, for example, when I think about what's changed with respect to the standing of science, I think about how COVID is really how people a major event that people are using in their minds to think about things. And so on one hand, it's like the creation of these vaccines was a great example of the successes of science, but then how we recommended, or how public health people recommended, social distancing and all sorts of other things with regard to masking, or just forecasting the trajectory of what's going to happen. Right? People could see that those type of models weren't successful, in medicine, it's a complicated picture. We have there's life-saving medicines, but then a lot of at the forefront of other questions like what is ADHD? It's very unsettled. Models are changing all the time, and so when we say things like settled science, or other phrases like the science says, then we sort of create this atmosphere where.
Is there a question in here someplace?
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious what you think about. What you guys think about how we're explaining science, teaching science?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Let me jump in. First thing is to say, whenever someone tells me, or I hear in the media, science shows, or research has demonstrated, I immediately know that this is actually not, almost certainly not, something that I would regard as being a finding of science. I think your example of the difference between medicine and public health is a crucial one. In public health, these are political decisions that are made with the best understanding of the science, what we know about diseases, infection, and so on and so forth. But they're political decisions, and one has to distinguish between those things. The science does not tell you exactly how to make public health decisions. The science doesn't prove that the right answer is this. The science finds out what we know about the reproducible behavior of nature that has been demonstrated by repeatable experiments. That doesn't solve these other things. And so I think drawing that distinction is very vital. In science, there is a tendency to wish to advocate for funding and support for science by pointing to the influence that it has on our society. That's not false, but it's also dangerous if we don't draw that distinction between politics and science.
And I think the COVID vaccinations were a classical example where people had different models, but then those that said, hey, if you had prior infection, maybe you shouldn't be forced to take the vaccine because you have some immunity, or it's so much more important to vaccinate the immunocompromised and elderly than kids or young people. They had a legitimate point. Now you can debate it, but some of these people were literally driven out of MGH and Harvard Medical School in Martin Kulldorff's case, or they could not readily publish their heterodox opinions. So in times like this, when we don't have final answers and different viewpoints, or maybe different models, right? Since you started with models, I think an open, robust debate that we open inquiry and a heterodox viewpoint and robust debate are so essential, and I think that really broke down during the pandemic.
On top of that, it is partly a communication problem, because scientists inherently know, especially in new developments, that there's a level of uncertainty, and we often know how to even quantify that. But the methods we have for communicating to the general public how that uncertainty works and how we regard it and how we're going about reducing it gets totally lost in translation.
And we often project a false certainty about what we know and don't know, and think that the general public doesn't need to know everything as long as we give them the right answer. Well, I think that has backfired a number of times.
Yes. Okay, yeah. The woman in the back in the red.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Rachel Altman. I'm also a statistician. I'm from Simon Fraser University near Vancouver in Canada. So I would love to get suggestions from the panel or the audience for what we can do to mobilize the moderate middle on campus, which is typically STEM, business, and economics in my experience. We don't have the same kind of funding problems in Canada because we elected a Liberal government. So it's not going to take this financial crisis that's going to affect change. We have a large heterodox campus community at my university that I and others created. So we've created a sort of safe space for people to oppose politicization. So it's not a question of fear, I don't think. It's simply a question, and I know just from talking to my colleagues, I know people basically oppose politicization of the university. It's so frustrating because I know we have the support of all these moderates, but just to get them off their butts and sign our letters, for example, that we spend hours and hours writing to oppose like inappropriate political activity of our administration, et cetera. It's almost impossible. And they don't know what's going on politically.
So this is a question of motivating.
Yes, how do we mobilize
these people, not just here in the U.S. but also in Canada?
Yeah, how do we mobilize?
How do we motivate ourselves and our potential allies and business and?
Well, my answer is when you find out, please tell me.
How is I always read a lot of stuff about Canada, and I have a question back. Like, how is the fear factor? Like, it gives me the impression that Canada has all these rules where you actually can discriminate, where job offers are open only to a woman of color or an indigenous person.
And in Canada, you can be penalized for speech.
Yeah, and you can be penalized. So how is the fear factor in Canada in relation to here?
I would say it probably depends where you go. But as I said, at my institution, I think it's pretty limited just because of, I can't tell if our group deserves all the credit, but basically we're large enough and we're loud and proud, and I think people have seen that none of us has experienced personal consequences. The hate speech laws, yes, they exist, but they are very rarely applied. So and like the bar is so high, it's not.
Well,
I know it's alarming to Americans.
How did Jordan Peterson get motivated? Okay.
Yeah, well, he's different because he's governed by a particular society, right? Professional society. So, is it trade association, right? So it's that's another conversation, right?
Okay.
But you asked about the fear factor. I would say no. I don't. I think it used to be, and that's why we formed our group, because some of us were so concerned that we keep hearing like sort of whispers in our ears, right? So no, I don't think that's it. It's literally just people are so busy and they just want to focus on their research.
I think you've almost given the answer. You have a dedicated group at MIT. You have about 6% of the professors are in the MIT CAF, but that's big enough to make a big difference. That's 60 professors who are no longer afraid. And you're not going to catch 80% of the
I will point out even
faculty.
more so when the Abbott cancellation happened at MIT, the letter that the faculty signed 2 months later requiring a statement on freedom of expression was signed by 150 faculty.
Yeah, so that's 15%.
Now we're talking 15%.
Yeah.
Sometimes you motivate
Okay,
people when
let's
something
move
bad
on.
happens.
This gentleman here has been very patient.
Yeah. Evan, I can see your question finger has been itchy. So.
Thanks. I'm Evan Morris from Yale. I have one sentence of context and a very short question. The context is, I'm a biomedical engineer, what I understand is that there are great Russian historians at Yale, but I didn't need to talk to a Russian historian to know about Lysenko. That's my context. Now here's my question. What is wrong with universities divorcing their humanities, which are totally polluted, from their STEM institutions? Why do I have to be at an institution with Russian historians if I can figure out whether my science is being politicized or not? I don't collaborate with any historians or English professors, and I don't see the value of it.
So I'll just provide some context and then you guys can answer. So at MIT, it's as about as pure STEM as you can get. But still 12% of the faculty are humanities. That department was only started about 100 years after MIT had been in existence. And why was it added? Who knows?
And what's the value
Did we
of
need
it?
it? So, did you want to answer that question?
Well, so I'm a scientist through and through, but I do appreciate. And when I was at high school, I hated history, and I hated literature. Okay, but as I've grown older, I actually have come to appreciate, reading about history and those kinds of things. So I do actually think that there is some benefit in a broad education. So that's one answer to your question. Why should STEM be associated with humanities and social studies? But I do think that there are many ways in which the social disciplines have become polluted. And I think, that I have very little patience personally with, let's say, the grievance studies disciplines, because I think that they're not truth-seeking organizations. They're social activist organizations, and I think that that's the distinction I would want to draw. Is universities have to be truth-seeking way before and overriding any intention to be socially activist.
I come from Europe, and in Europe and Germany, you study physics or math, or you study literature. So you don't have the liberal arts education that you get in college here. I think it's a great strength of the UK and the US system that even as a STEM technologist, scientist, engineer, you get partially a liberal arts education. I think it adds very valuable other tools to reasoning and to perspective. A too narrow of a STEM view, I would advocate against that, and maybe if your suggestion was shouldn't we split Yale into two pieces, or Harvard or NYU or whatever it might be, I would, coming from the STEM side, I would advocate and argue against that. But we should check: is every subject and is every topic, is it? I mean, perhaps something about relevance and the merit of this, the academic merit of the subject. Is it part of knowledge seeking? And sometimes it's maybe more advocacy. I don't know that Russian literature is advocacy. It probably has its own merits that someone should study this.
So, Luana, should there be a Williams Institute of Technology?
So we were founded on a liberal arts kind of thing, and I also was not raised on a liberal arts, and I do appreciate having a certain degree of humanities in any undergraduate's life. I think what happened, and I think it's actually really sad that the serious humanities are being consumed and taken away by the grievance studies, ludicrous courses and activities, which are, they are entirely ideological and activists. And the students take those courses more. And they take those courses more to a very large extent, and it's because it's an easy A. Everyone can get an easy A. And that has diluted the serious humanities, and because they are joined together in a single pact, taking the value away from them. And I think above all, the serious people in humanities should be pushing back against this downfall.
Well, we're cutting into your break time, but John cut into our time a little bit too, so it's okay. We're going to take one more question. This lady right here has been very patient.
And the gentleman here perhaps as well.
Oh, with the microphone, please.
Maybe two more.
My question is close to the polar opposite of the one that happened previously. I'm a normative philosopher. I do legal philosophy at the University of Surrey School of Law in the UK. I appreciated in particular Ian's comments on the domains of knowledge and what we can uncover scientifically and what requires other types of disciplined reasoning. It seems to me like a lot of the big public policy questions that we face are blended questions, and so this is a central problem. People do want public health recommendations. They do want climate change policy recommendations, and yet to make such a recommendation rigorously requires my discipline and yours. So the question is, how do we put our heads together, I think, because very few of us are smart enough to be both great at the hard sciences and also great at normative reasoning. How do we produce that kind of cooperation and produce the recommendations that are authoritative that people seem to want?
Couldn't agree more, and also keep heterodox views in both fields.
And if you need some glimmers of hope, the MIT Council on Academic Freedom was initially founded by the activities of two philosophers, and here's a hardcore scientist who's joined together. So, and I certainly, and I think many of our members see the benefits of that. So yeah, thank you for that viewpoint, and I do think you're absolutely
You're
right.
really a shill for the Heterodox Academy, right? Because the answer is you got to practice open discourse.
Exactly.
Entertain diverse viewpoints and engage in constructive disagreement, right? I think our perception is the humanities have sort of lost that vision.
Or many of them have.
Many of them. Mm-hmm. We're ready, willing, and able, because that's what we do every day in science. Okay, thank you I'm sorry that's at the end. Thank you very much. Let's give a great hand to the panelists and a hand to you all for such great participation. Thank you.
Thank you.